You have arrived, and the glow of success has warmed you. But inevitably, at some time, the lonely winds that sweep the heights will chill your spirits and make you wonder why you ever wanted to be there in the first place. For success carries its special burdens, and no one understands them as fully as the one who has carried them. Bearing this special burden of success and achievement is sometimes too much for the executive, and he'll flame briefly and brightly and disappear, never able to make that final rappel to a secure footing. The greatest achievement of all is learning to live with your success. Among executives, living with success is an ever-present specter, which, like a disgraceful relative, is seldom mentioned. So it was with rare frankness that a handful of members of a business and professional men's service club in a Midwestern city talked with greater and greater frequency of some of the problems they had found in dealing with their own success situations. As each man's story unfolded, the others were amazed and delighted to learn how much they had in common, and how the solutions of one could serve as solutions for almost any of them. Then the group went a step beyond. One member, to fill in the gap left by a guest speaker who failed to show up, gave an extemporaneous talk in which he told of how he had dealt with a particular problem in living with his own success. This was the keynote for what became a series of talks that was greeted with enthusiasm by the successful upper and middle management members of the club. Some of the speakers were members of the club, some were non-members, but all were men who had learned to glean the most from success and take zestful pleasure in living with it. Charles Renshaw, the member who had made the extemporaneous speech that started the series, was chairman of the club's speakers committee and had come from a large New England city to take his present position. In addressing the club, he began by retracing his steps.
As most of you know, I came here after spending several years with a small instruments company near Boston, where I'd become very much at home in my job. I grew up in Western Massachusetts, went to college there, and had never worked for any other company but the one of which I eventually became president. And when the board elevated me to that final eminence, I was 45 and ready for a real bed of roses. I felt certain that I'd just slide into things as easily as a knife going through hot butter. And that's when I broke the first rule of living with success. I took it for granted that my problems were over when actually they'd just begun. A seemingly endless line formed in the anteroom of my beautiful new office, even before the stationery had been changed. I felt like a Navy doctor just assigned to a new ship who finds everyone going on sick call. There were problems to be solved and decisions to be made that even after over 20 years with the company I'd never known to exist before. And the problems some of that anteroom crowd had and the changes they had in mind were pretty sweeping, to say the least. For instance, Tom Hanrahan, who was our sales vice president, had his pet project. He came bustling into my office, armed with charts, flip cards, and his usual...
Let me tell you, Charlie, making you president was the best thing that could ever happen to this company. Now, what I mean is, with your fresh point of view, it'll be a cinch to open up those overseas markets I've been planning for all these years. And
wait a minute, Red. That's a big move. And there's some other matters that have to be attended to immediately. That means that some things will have to be postponed, and I'm afraid...
You mean that I'm going to have to keep on waiting until...
Until I can study your proposal and give it the attention it deserves before I make any kind of decision.
Well, I don't want you to say no, but...
Then let me get to it in my own time, Red.
Charlie Renshaw told his fellow club members of a half-dozen more matters that seemed terribly urgent to the people who brought them up. And certainly they were important.
You see, I had to get everything into proper perspective and establish sound priorities. Actually, the job that I tackled first was getting rid of our purchasing manager. His relationships with our suppliers was costing us nearly half our profits. The man was a thief, plain and simple, and I could prove it. I let him go quietly and got a really fine man to replace him. And incidentally, we did get to Red Hanrahan's pet project, but it was nearly 2 years later. I'll never forget the awesome experience, though, the feeling that I was in the path of an avalanche of problems to be solved and decisions to be made, and as President Truman said, the buck stopped there. This is probably the toughest part of learning to live with your success, the discovery that you're going to have to work harder, think harder, try harder than you ever did before you achieved your goal. And that's why when I came to my present position, I was delighted that I had the board 100% behind me and willing to demonstrate their support.
Renshaw went on to tell the story of an executive friend who was appointed president of a company, and one board member asked one of the president's subordinates to keep an eye on his new boss and report back regularly.
Not a common occurrence, I'm sure, but it's the kind of unexpected thing that you must be prepared for when you achieve success. Fortunately, my friend found out about it early on and confronted the board. With him, he had a list of priorities of the things that he intended to do as president and how he intended to accomplish them. And then he insisted that the board respond as to whether his proposal was acceptable to them. They agreed enthusiastically, and he followed up by insisting that they demonstrate their support of his presidency publicly. They gave an impressive banquet in his honor, to which all top and middle management executives in the company were invited. My friend had been in a bad spot, but he managed to get out of it successfully because he'd gone into his job knowing what he intended to do and how he intended to do it. His greatest armor against disaster had been that when he gained success, he never assumed that the way would be paved for him. He never expected a bed of roses.
A few weeks after Charlie Renshaw's talk, the Living with Success series at the club was in full swing, and a speaker was scheduled each month. The second speaker was a very colorful man named Hank Cardigan. He'd been noted for rescuing a number of small and medium-sized companies from disaster. A great deal of this success was attributed, with some basis for belief, to a keen sense of flamboyant showmanship and timing. And so it was entirely appropriate for Cardigan, white-haired, lean, impressive, even if he had not sported a magnificent mustache, to title his topic, Set Your Style and Take Charge.
Thank you. Mr. President, members, and distinguished guests, I believe I can illustrate the heart of what I have to say with a story about General George S. Patton. It seems that General Eisenhower had assigned a brigadier general to Patton's command, and General Patton protested, saying that he couldn't accept a man who was that incompetent. Too late, said Ike, the man's already assigned to you. Well, as it turned out, the man was a genius at only one thing: snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. And General Eisenhower told General Patton, said, George, you're going to have to relieve that man. Not now, snapped Patton. Ike protested, said, George, just a few months ago, you were refusing to accept him in your command. Well, that's right, retorted Patton. But he was one of your generals then. Now he's one of mine. I'll straighten him out myself. Well, now, no one could ever rightfully accuse General Patton of being unable to live with success, no matter what other flaws he may have had. He sought success, lived with it, under it, on it, around it. He wrapped himself in success, and he reveled in it. Success was home to him, mainly, I believe, because he was a past master at taking charge. There was never anything low profile about George Patton, and this seemed to be characteristic of all the high-ranking horse cavalry officers. During the last war, I was for a time executive officer under a regular Army colonel of cavalry whose service record and battle ribbons went back to the Philippine insurrection, right on through the Boxer uprising and leading cavalrymen under Blackjack Pershing in Mexico, dedicated and honorable service in World War I in France. During World War II, he was called back from retirement to bring some order out of chaos at a series of new training centers. Now, I remember that whenever he took command, the colonel would conduct a minute inspection of the post with particular attention to enlisted areas until he found something not up to his high standards. Oh, and then the fur would fly. There's nothing in regulations that says enlisted men have to live under these conditions, he'd bark, or who's responsible for leaving the troops in this kind of mess, he'd demand. Well, the culprit would be discovered, reprimanded, and transferred to some less desirable duty. In no time, word would spread throughout all ranks that the old man was looking out for his troops. And that he was. He was perceptive, tough, and just, all things that men admire in their leaders. Actually, he'd set his style and taken charge in a colorful, dramatic, and highly visible fashion. The leaders in management can do the same thing by making a point of signaling their arrival with some highly popular decision that will not interfere with normal pursuit of business. This doesn't mean that you should dodge the unpopular decisions, but welcome simple changes are excellent for openers. Now, of course, we all know that in some companies there's so many checks and balances that even a presidential decision may take months to come to fruition. This means that you're going to have to raise your profile in other ways, simple ways that are within your power to demonstrate immediately. Now, a successor of mine told me about an experience he had shortly after he took over a company of which I'd been president for 6 years. His name is Stuart Desmond, and here's what he had to say.
Hank, you know, your profile was so high when you left that I had to make some pretty drastic moves to establish my own style, which, though firm, is a lot lower key than yours. Now, I first realized my problem when I found a department head using my name, unbeknownst to me, to get a whole divisional office to work through a weekend, getting up information I wanted. Well, that might have been your style, Hank, but honestly, it isn't mine. So I called a meeting and enlightened all of our managers on the Desmond style vis-a-vis the Cardigan style, with special emphasis on what papers I wanted to have cross my desk and what ones I didn't, and how open my open-door policy really was, and that it's my style to make suggestions rather than give orders. But I expect those suggestions to be taken darn seriously, especially when I don't hear any objections. Well, it's taken us a while to get used to each other, but at last it's working out very well.
I'd pick Stu for the job of president as my successor, and planning for a successor is always high on my priority list. Stu and I are not alike at all, except that each of us has his own way of getting the job done, and we insist that our way be observed. Each of us lives comfortably with his success because we know and understand how this works, and how important to living with your success is knowing how to set your style and take charge.
Sometimes in the process of becoming successful, we forget that much of what we have become, much of the way in which we have succeeded, has come from the impact that we have had on other people. Herbert Tryon, president of a light aircraft manufacturing firm, travels thousands of miles each year, maintaining personal contacts with suppliers, branch offices, and customers. Charlie Renshaw, knowing that Tryon was a frequent visitor to his city, asked him if he would speak to the club on his version of living with success. And as might be expected from a man on the move, Tryon's advice was to keep in touch with people.
And so, I say the surest way of living with success and not failing at it is to keep in aware and sensitive contact with the world around you. I think it all begins on the first day that you move into that higher position you're shooting for. In any case, the words you speak as if by magic will never again be taken lightly. You've got to remember your effect on people, that they're hanging on your every word, trying to bend those words to fit their hopes and aspirations. If it's been your practice to say good morning to a particular person in your office, and suddenly, innocently, you forget to say it one day, that person is very likely to start fretting about what he may have done to incur your displeasure. If you've changed companies to get that top job, you'll probably find language barriers impeding your progress without you ever being aware of them. A friend of mine, a president of a competing firm, tells about the first week that he joined his company as its president. He was speaking to his sales vice president.
If you're free at 9 tomorrow morning, I'd like to meet with you and your marketing people in the conference room and talk about market forecasts.
Well, the people showed up bright and smiling at the right place and the right time, looking expectantly at their new president, and he was looking just as expectantly at them. The embarrassment of silence was finally broken by small talk when my friend failed to lead a discussion. It was then that, with great perception, he realized what had happened.
Well, I can see that we're not tuned in on the same frequency this morning, and perhaps it's my fault. Now, when I said I wanted to chat about market forecast, I was counting on you to work up the material we would chat about. After all, that's your special province. So, let's try again, here, same time tomorrow. Bring all available data that affects marketing of our products. And let's have good news and bad, problems and solutions. And we'll follow up with serious discussion.
It's important that you learn the existing language of your company. It's sort of like being an ambassador to a foreign country. You are at a distinct advantage if you learn the native tongue. And it's a good idea to line up some interpreters right away to make sure that communications are all on one wavelength.
Herbert Tryon brought up a second point about touching the human bases, and in so doing underscored one of the great side benefits of success, and how the natural inclination to overuse it could end in failure.
As you move into higher and higher positions of leadership and responsibility, you're provided with more and more means of shutting yourself off from the world and the company. Now, this insulation by delegation, this island-making capability is essential to a business leader who needs periods of privacy to think, to plan, to reason. And yet, there's a very human temptation to overuse this benefit until you're so out of touch with everything that your decisions become inept, your plans unrealistic, and your leadership a disastrous failure. Delegation is important, but don't delegate yourself out of the mainstream of action so far that you don't know what's really going on, and worse yet, to the point that you have your employees consider you a figurehead who is a do-nothing in the company.
And finally, Herbert Tryon had something to say about industrial statesmanship.
It's really just another way of getting out into the world. A business leader must be an enlightened man who recognizes that business is a cornerstone of society. Business is something more than a means of making a profit. It also must create wealth for the society it serves. Most of all, it must develop people. If you look at it in that way, a business leader who's grown through living with his success has become a statesman. And as a statesman, he realizes that he must serve the people who, directly or indirectly, are his customers. He must provide them with opportunities for growth as people, as communities, and as a nation. The business leader who forgets that there's a social side to business, who is dedicated solely to making a track record, who fails to touch the human basis on his way around, will fail, and fail disastrously, in living with his success.
Today's speaker has worked with you, played with you, and above all, nagged you ever since most of you joined this club. Many of you he's served personally and has shared both tragedy and triumph. He's distinguished himself in our city as a man who heals bodies. He has distinguished himself in our midst as a decent, forthright man who's no slouch at healing the spirit. There's nothing more important to living with your success than taking care of yourself. And here to tell you how it's done, without mincing any words, I'm sure, is our friend and fellow member, Dr. George Forsythe.
Thank you, Charlie. Your introduction is generous, but I must correct you on one point. I amend your statement by saying that there's nothing more important to living, period, than taking care of yourself. But you high-powered executives can preen your egos with the dubious fact that you do have some special problems associated with pressure, worry, and the tendency to sit down a lot. Now, I'd like to preface my remarks with a famous motto, the motto of another fine service club, Rotary. He profits most who serves best. And that's where good health for a business or professional man begins, serving best. There's no legitimate business activity that can't be used as a channel of service to society if you're willing to relate your job to a goal larger than your own self-interest. Don't make your purpose in working just a paycheck or a promotion. You'll be a lot happier in your work if you think of your little wheels as the ones that make the big wheels go. Now, I could stand here for the rest of the day and talk to you about businessman's ailments, but I know you know them as well as I do. They're hypertension, coronary artery disease, colitis, arthritis, and all of the big parade. And I could prescribe a fistful of tranquilizers and other pills that would give you some relief. But your best chance at good health comes from a healthy attitude and a healthy mind. And now here's my prescription.
Doc started off by prescribing that every one of us develop the kind of relationship with our staffs that allowed us to blow our stacks once in a while without tearing the whole organization apart. He put restrictions on our taking jobs home with us while conceding that there were times when we couldn't avoid it. But these times should be few and far between. Finally, he said to be sure to save some time and vitality for our families, including shared interests and hobbies, because these are things that bind families together.
And that brings me to another point. Start getting ready for retirement right now, and not just by buying annuities. You start planning on what you're going to do, how you're going to live when the time comes. Develop those plans as part-time interests now so you'll slide into them comfortably and joyfully at retirement time. And take at least one vacation a year. 2 would be better, about 6 months apart in 2-week segments. And remember, the flag is down on misuse of alcohol and drugs. Some of the primmest law-abidingest businessmen are the worst drug abusers I know, forever badgering their doctors or druggists or friends for drugs to wake them up, calm them down, or put them out of the world entirely. And for Pete's sake, it's just about as bad when you build all of your rest and relaxation activities around alcohol, so that every social relationship with family, friends, and associates serves as just another excuse to trot out the booze. Just because it's expensive doesn't make it any different from cheap wine or rot gut used for the same purpose.
Then Doc Forsythe, after a few more well-chosen comments, changed his tack from mental health to physical health.
Now, the whole idea, of course, is to live longer and have the strength to enjoy it. Now, you can't change your ancestors, and this longer, better life is in part inherited, but there are a lot of things you can do to make up for it. For instance, try to avoid heart disease. If it's important enough to you, give up smoking and live longer. Then there's the matter of cholesterol. A proper diet goes a long way toward controlling that. If you'll cut out high cholesterol foods like dairy and meat fats, egg yolks, and the like. Replace them with polyunsaturated fats. Now, of course, an important preventative is keeping your weight down. You don't need a fancy diet. Just eat good balanced meals each day. But don't serve yourself as much. Try cutting your servings in half for a while. Just be sure you get dairy products, fruits and vegetables, cereals, including bread and proteins every day.
Hey, Doc.
Yeah?
How about exercise?
Just hold your horses. I'm going to get to that in a minute. Now, we hear about 3 good balanced meals a day, but I'm about convinced that we ought to eat 7 or 8 little meals a day. Anyway, you fat guys probably eat a light breakfast and let it go at that. But there on in, it's one big banquet, right? All right, now cut that out. Eat a good, hearty, balanced breakfast, modest lunch, and a light supper. Eat heaviest for the time when you burn the most energy. Now, if any of you people take cocktails for lunch, remember, it's going to slow down your efficiency to some degree. Instead of that, treat yourself to a 15-minute doze in that big, comfortable office chair of yours after lunch. Try just shutting your eyes. That'll pay big dividends. Now, about exercise. Try walking 30 minutes a day, briskly. You'll burn off about 10 pounds of excess weight a year that way. Swimming's great exercise. And try 2 or 3 flights of stairs in your office building, if they still make stairs. Yard work's fine. If you have a lawn of manageable size, get a push mower. There's nothing sillier than some big, fat slob riding around on a power mower on a yard the size of his bedroom. Remember, good health is good sense and a realistic sense of values.
Gentlemen, the gratifying attendance at this special Friday night meeting is a tribute to tonight's guest and his many achievements. How many times have we introduced speakers from this platform by saying, "Our speaker needs no further introduction"? And how especially true this is in the case of tonight's speaker, who has made a special trip to our city for the purpose of addressing this club. And yet, our speaker claims he does need further introduction, even though his spectacular business leadership before he was 30 is legendary. His later growth to the very pinnacle of success is an inspiration. Yet he reminds me that there were 5 years of his life which are never accounted for. And it's about these years of total failure, that he wants to talk tonight. In introducing him, he's asked me to use these words that he's furnished me exactly. He's further requested that I not mention his name, to remind you that his story could be yours or that of a rising and brilliant employee in your company. So be it. This man does need further introduction. In his words, he's a failure, a drunk, a hypochondriac who quarreled with his associates, was unproductive, hiding behind a welter of little detail and 3 martini lunches to keep up the pretense of activity. I give you our speaker, who could be any one of you, if you don't know the symptoms of executive flameout.
It does take you back, doesn't it? Well, it's a platform trick, I confess, but every word of it is true. Executive flameout. The sudden meteoric rise with bright fires flashing in every direction, followed by the shocking fall in a column of dying sparks and smoke, is an all too common, tragic phenomenon of our times. A few survive. And those who do come back to some acceptable way of life because they recognize their problem and meet it forthrightly, and because they have friends and employers who are willing to help. Now, just what is executive flameout? A noted production manager throws over a lucrative job to become a horticulturist and calls it a career reappraisal. A sales manager in his early 40s spends more and more time away from his job. Other employees snicker and say that he's out to drunch. And when he's fired, his employers call it alcoholism. My own story was typical. 32, I was executive vice president of a medium-sized heavy equipment firm on the West Coast. Much had been made of my success, and I was regarded as one of those rising young Turks of industry. Unfortunately, even with my success, I found myself developing conflicts with other executives, employees, customers, suppliers, even the char lady who had cleaned my office for years. Then came the sleeplessness, the 3 martini lunches and 4 martini dinners, hypochondria, and very real incipient ulcers. By now, I was making it to work only 2-3 times a week. I was deviating from company policies and even my own objectives. I'd spend hours redesigning a letterhead or cleaning out my desk instead of tackling what had once been exciting challenges. On my 36th birthday, the president of our company sent me on an extended vacation after a fatherly talk. But it didn't do much good. I was back in the old pattern soon enough. The president was unbelievably patient. He offered every kind of motivation possible. and I couldn't respond. It was as though I were locked in overdrive, careening down a steep hill without brakes. I wanted to stop, but nothing seemed to work. Well, finally, I resigned. I joined AA. I got myself back in good physical condition, and then I began to reappraise myself. Fortunately, I had enough money to keep going for a while, and a wonderful, understanding family. I went out and got myself a job as a dragline operator, running the very equipment that I had been manufacturing and selling. And as it turned out, I developed a whole new perspective on the product, and finally went to the company over which I now preside. I was no longer worrying about getting to the top and staying there. I was excited by a new concept of sales and service that I had, and this provided me with an immediate, realistic, exciting objective, which I pursued with confidence. Once there, I could see another similar objective, and so on. I didn't concern myself with how many years I had left to reach the top or how many people were pushing me from behind. I immersed myself in the exciting job at hand, and in time, the rest took care of itself. Well, in the course of things, I went to a psychiatrist who helped me a great deal. He's made considerable study of the executive flameout phenomenon, and I've asked him to record some of his views on the subject. Now, as I play it now, I hope you listen carefully and remember, I can attest that every word of it is true.
The midlife crisis that strikes between the mid-30s and mid-40s is faced by everyone, but most people pass through it so smoothly that they aren't even aware of it. As you approach your mid-30s, you suddenly realize that you're not going to live forever. And when you reach this hard, cold fact that youth won't go on forever and that you must die someday, you have to be realistic and willing to settle for a little less than you'd hoped for. Obviously, the effects on the person who set his sights too high can be anything from unsettling to devastating. And this is the age bracket that's highest in AA membership and suicides among businessmen. And it's not helped by the heavy emphasis on youth culture, which has arisen in recent years. You're struggling intensely to be king of the hill. You're stuck with mortgage payments, and you're worried as to where you're being swept by the relentless course of events. Perhaps your skills and knowledge are fast becoming outmoded. You see younger men passing you on the ladder of success. Sometimes, even death seems a better alternative than failure in your goals.
A black picture. But now, if you find these symptoms in yourself, and I'm talking mainly now to you men between 35 and 45, or see them in others, you will recognize them as stages of executive flameout. Then what do? Well, you have one alternative. You must adjust, and to do this, you have a great thing going for you, the flexibility and adaptability that is an integral part of the executive makeup. Use it. Find new realistic goals, new measurements of success. Realize that being a division manager or vice president can be far more rewarding to you personally than being president. Start by considering the job of presidency of the United States. The drawbacks of the job are starkly and terrifyingly obvious. Any unrealistic goal can contain the same drawbacks for you. Look for these unrealistic goals, and you'll find them. Chances are you'll be utterly miserable if you ever get there. Remember that the successful executive is the executive who has learned to live both a useful and gratifying life. That is success without executive flameout. The last speaker had so much dramatic impact that the club members really didn't think that another speaker could, in a different way, have as shocking effect. But Everett Alton a man who had built a conglomerate of food processing and transportation industries, did just that. Interestingly enough, he also dealt with the psychological causes for failure of business executives in living with their success, but he viewed a different aspect to the problem and offered some specific remedies. Dynamic and dramatic, Alton's opening comments represented a real shock to the membership.
Look at the man sitting at your right. Look at him well, because he's a potential failure. That's right. There's a latent failure factor built into every one of us. And when it decides to surface and take over, it can completely ruin your life. Now, fortunately, there is an antidote, and I'll tell you about it later. But first, you have to recognize the ailment when it gets hold of you. Some symptoms. A young executive is told that he's favored for a coveted promotion and promptly develops a nervous breakdown. A Major League Baseball hitter with a 300-plus batting average suddenly can't find the ball anymore, even though he appears to be at the very peak of his capabilities. A successful disc jockey takes to drink, and his happy marriage goes to pieces. Now, let's get closer to home. About 3 years ago, I deeply regretted having to let an executive go, especially because I'd been grooming him to take over my job someday. He'd moved from traffic manager of one of our truck depots to vice president in 10 years, and he knew that it wouldn't stop there. Yet suddenly, he developed a syndrome of sniping at every new executive we brought into the company, generating personality problems that had never existed before. Well, finally, he became such a vortex of incessant infighting that I had to let him go. Nothing I could do or say seemed to improve him. And then there was another case. Another young executive of high potential and similar growth record, after being turned down on a dramatic and daring idea, temporarily just settled back to a perfunctory performance of his job, while breaking a cardinal company rule, moonlighting as a consultant. He didn't need the money, and he didn't try to hide his breach of company policy. It was as though he were defying me. Why had these two men, successful and happy in their work, suddenly programmed themselves for failure? Somehow, subconsciously, these men desired failure and courted it deliberately. Each had the taste of success in his mouth, and it was bitter to him. Each literally spit it out. Actually, it is reasonable to believe that an executive's failure fix lies in an intensification of his normal behavior patterns, the very patterns that carried them to success in the first place.
Everett Alton went on to explain that the failure-bent executive who, for example, was a success because of his responsiveness to the people around him, found an increasing need as he approached the top of his career for checking up on how he was going over with others. He became sensitive to criticism, which was often imagined. Finally, his hunger to receive overpowers his capability to give, and his fear of disapproval blunts the keen edge of decisiveness, leading to the ultimate failure he seeks.
But why? The why lies in your definition of success. Too often we look on success as being a material achievement, made up of wealth and power. For a very few men, this might be true. But these are men who are willing to achieve that kind of success at the sacrifice of important personal values. If, for example, deep in his heart, a man's real evaluation of success is to have people love him, and he finds himself being hated as he nears the top, he is likely to program himself for failure. Now, the secret in avoiding a failure fix is to get an honest perspective of yourself.
Alton recommended forming the habit of realistic self-appraisal at every step of one's career. And he had a trick for getting started.
At your place, when you sat down today, you saw a little card. Now, printed on this card are 3 questions. Now take that card and follow along with me as I ask these 3 questions. First, do you like your job? Second, have you been successful at it? Third, is it taking you where you want to go? Now, put the card in your pocket. And when you have time to think by yourself, take that card out again and try to find some honest answers. They won't be clear-cut, and you'll find other questions arising. The most important of these will be, what do I really want? Try to answer that one precisely. To what degree is your answer influenced by what other people possess? And how about power? Power to do what? Power over how many people? How do you define happiness? If you were given unlimited leisure without a care in the world, just what would you do with that leisure?
Finally, Everett Alton gave the answer to a question that he had asked at the beginning of his talk. How do you know if you're enmeshed in a failure pattern?
Ask yourself objectively, have I become a nose-to-the-grindstone man, carrying more and more work home with me each night? Am I more and more detail-conscious, more than when my job was narrower? Am I becoming more critical of subordinates, more sparing in praise? Is my impatience for advancement becoming unbearably keen and still growing? Is my willingness to move my subordinates along diminishing? Do I depend more and more on my own instincts than the advice and the experience of others? The important thing is that you have the ability to be objective and then dedicated to the hard, careful work necessary to reevaluate your ideas of success. Then program yourself for success, your kind of success.
Just 50 years ago, this past June, a young manager of an ironworks sat bent over his desk on a sunny Saturday afternoon. Suddenly, his works foreman burst in the door.
For the love of heaven, Mr. Crittenden, this is your wedding day, and you're due at the altar in less than half an hour.
Yes, that was our own Alf Crittenden, who loved his job so much that he was late for his own wedding. It doesn't seem to have hurt his marriage, though, because he celebrated his golden anniversary along with his 80th birthday this year. He's still running his business, which by now is probably the largest industrial complex in this area. And by the big smile he always wears, you can tell he loves every minute of it. I know we've lined up the right speaker for the last in our series on living with your success. Here's Alfred H. Crittenden, our own Alf, to tell you how to enjoy your job as much as he enjoys his.
Thank you, Charlie. Of course, you can't overdo loving your job as I once did, only once, I assure you, or the way an acquaintance of mine did. He'd always been a salesman. After he was made president of his company, he just stayed out on the road, calling on customers, doing what he loved most. Now, meanwhile, his company's organizational structure sagged, a brilliant cost control plan bogged down, and an important building program died a-borning. Well, fortunately, he caught up with his sins of omission in time and discovered a genuine new delight in making the wheels turn. So there's a lot of difference between making play out of work and playing at work. You know, in these talks we've been having, I've learned a lot in every one, and I've certainly found much I can agree with, but I'm going to try to give you another way of looking at things. Now, there's been a lot of talk and a lot said about what makes men fail and how they can keep from having it happen. And there's been a lot of wisdom there. But along with that, I believe that the happiest executive is a dissatisfied executive. Part of the executive temperament is made up of joy in the feeling of power, and part in the joy of being able to create policies and programs at the raw level. Behind this is a kind of, call it divine discontent, an itch that needs to be scratched. Well, in my experience, the best executives are the most dissatisfied. Now, they may get a kick out of their money and their jobs, but they're ulcerous worrywarts by nature. By nature. In spite of what Doc says, and they delight in their own dissatisfaction. But this is a special kind of discontent that stimulates creative powers. In good times, it's competition, mergers, dispersion, product changes, new technology, all that sort of things fret him. In bad times, it's retrenchment, reshuffling, and scuffling to keep going. But in any time, an executive is a person who is stimulated by adversity. Even these things can become too much, or too frequent, of course, especially when teamed with pressures of specialization, over-control, infighting, duties, authority, taxes, labor problems, and touchy world conditions. Plus, the loneliness of the job. That loneliness that made William Howard Taft say, after his first few weeks as President of the United States, "No one stops in for the evening." And the yes man. Finally, the poor executive has gotten so far from enjoying the challenges of his job that to ease his tensions, he's surrounded himself with men who always agree with him. Now, he can't trust them, because he doesn't really know whether their answers to important questions are candid or not. Then there's the executive who tends toward perfectionism. He doesn't have much fun either. Neither does the man at the end of a dead-end street, years before retirement, to whom the challenge and the fun are gone. But cheer up. There's always something you can do about it. I guess I've hit close to home, huh? Well, we all have had bad days, and the idea is to make them as few as possible. And here's how you can do it. Begin by seeing your job not just as managing a business, so much as managing people. Make this your number one challenge. Managing people. Getting them to get the job done. The better you do this job, the better your department or organization will be, and the happier you will be in your job. Next, start thinking about what you can and will do to guide your company's destiny, and let your subordinates tell you how to do it. Today, right now, develop the habit of asking yourself just what in the world you're worrying about. You know, every man builds his own pressure. It's a subjective thing. That's why one man can be bothered by a problem that doesn't give the next man the slightest concern. So take your worries apart and dispose of them. Now, you're going to manage your employees more effectively if you give them frequent chances to evaluate themselves. This stimulates their confidence in your interest in them. And you've got to have this kind of give and take if you're going to enjoy your job. It ensures that people are in positions that give them greatest satisfaction, and that, in turn, means they'll perform better. And this is bound to delight you. Now, let's say, after all these years, you find the promotion path clogged. Well, this is bound to be disappointing, discouraging, frustrating. But it's not a time for moping. It's a time for action. Set your sights on new goals within the scope of your job and authority. Remember that a great actor can be a star performer in a bit part. Most of all, as you live your years, they'll be joyful and full if you have a philosophy you believe in and a clear, honest, sound sense of values to guide you. It's the best way not only to enjoy your job, but to enjoy every minute of the wonderful life that's been given to you.